It's the dead of night on a Virginia plantation. The main house door creaks open and a white woman in her silk nightgown steps into the darkness. She's on the hunt for her next target. She approaches the cabin of a young black man, barely 20 years old. He's exhausted from 16 hours in the tobacco fields, but sleep won't come tonight, for she pushes open his door without permission, without hesitation. He knows what this means. He knows he has no choice. You'll do as I say, and if you refuse, I'll tell my husband you tried to force yourself on me. We both know how that story ends. The young man's heart pounds, not with desire, but with terror. He understands the trap he's in. Comply and be violated. Refuse and face the noose. This is the reality that thousands of enslaved black men faced at the hands of white women in the American South. Everything you think you know about sweet Southern belles and their fancy dresses, that whole story about delicate white women who needed protection, it's all a lie. Today, we're about to destroy one of America's biggest myths and expose the truth about how white women systematically tortured, abused, and dehumanized black men. Because these women weren't victims, they were monsters. And it's time the world knew their real story. Let's start with some facts that'll wake you up real quick. By 1860, white women owned about 40% of all enslaved people in America. And in some areas, they owned even more slaves than their husbands did. Take Martha Washington. Yeah, the First Lady. When she married George Washington in 1759, he owned about 18 enslaved people. But here's the kicker. Martha owned 84. 84! She brought more enslaved people to that marriage than her famous husband ever did. And Martha wasn't unusual. When wealthy families had daughters, they gave them enslaved people as dowries because owning black folks made a white woman a better marriage prospect. The more slaves you owned, the more attractive you were to potential husbands. Think about that for a minute. These women's entire identities were built on owning other human beings. Now, you might be wondering, if this is true, why didn't we learn about it in school? For the longest time, historians believed the same myths everyone else did. They looked at what white women wrote about themselves. And, surprise, surprise, those women painted themselves as innocent victims who barely participated in slavery. But when researchers finally started listening to the people who lived through it, a completely different picture emerged. And that picture? It's ugly as hell. By the way, before we dive in, I want to personally ask you to subscribe to our channel. Each one of you that's watching and sharing our videos helps spread our message of Black empowerment and resilience. The truth cannot and will not be hidden. For white women in the South, slavery wasn't just about free labor. It was about freedom, their own freedom from their husband's control. When a white woman got married back then, everything she owned legally became her husband's property. Her money, her land, everything. It was called coverture, and it meant married women had about as much legal power as children. But smart white families found ways around this system. They created prenuptial agreements and trust funds that let women keep control of their property, including their enslaved people, even after marriage. So while white women couldn't vote or own businesses, they could own, buy, sell, and torture black people. For them, our enslavement was literally their ticket to independence. And they started training for this role early. Little white girls, some as young as 9 months old, were given enslaved children as gifts. By the time they could walk, they were learning how to give orders to black adults. By the time they were toddlers, they were being taught that beating black people was normal. There's this story from the court records about a 3-year-old white girl named Lizzie Anna Burwell, who demanded that her father cut off a black servant's ears and get her a new maid from town. 3 years old, and her father, he did it. We're about to get into some really dark territory, guys. Because white women didn't just own enslaved people, they actively worked to create more of them through forced breeding of black men. And I want you to understand just how calculated and cruel this was. Some enslaved men were kept specifically as stockmen, human beings reserved for the sole purpose of being forced upon enslaved women. White women would hire these men out to other plantations, literally renting them for breeding purposes. Maggie Stenhouse, who survived slavery, described how her enslaver would lock a stockman in a room with multiple young women, forcing them into intimate situations against their will. When the enslaver came back the next morning, the man was grateful to be released because, in Stenhouse's words, them women nearly killed him. But the white women organizing this didn't care about the trauma they were causing to black men. One formerly enslaved individual described how enslavers in Kentucky only allowed the strong, healthy slave women to have children, and often prevented them from being with their own husbands. Instead, their enslavers bred them like livestock to some male who was kept for that purpose because of his strong physique, which the master wished to reproduce. These weren't relationships. These were organized exploitation orchestrated by white women who saw black men as nothing more than breeding stock. Now, I need y'all to understand something. When we talk about the violence of slavery, we can't just focus on white men. White women were just as brutal, just as cruel, and just as willing to use terror to maintain control over black men. White women used violence to police and control the intimate lives of enslaved black men. They constantly watched them, monitored their relationships, and used the threat of family separation as a weapon. But the violence wasn't just physical. White women used psychological warfare too. They understood that controlling black men's most intimate relationships, who they loved, who they married, who they had children with, was the ultimate form of domination. In Harriet Jacobs's narrative, she wrote about how planters' daughters would take advantage of male slaves. She described how a white woman selected one of the meanest slaves on his plantation to be the father of his first grandchild. She did not make her advances to her equals, nor even to her father's more intelligent servants. She selected the most brutalized, over whom her authority could be exercised with less fear of exposure. This was predatory behavior, pure and simple. These relationships couldn't be consensual because of the massive power imbalance. Captain Richard J. Hinton, an abolitionist commander in the Civil War, testified that I have never found a bright-looking colored man whose confidence I have won who has not told me of instances where he has been compelled either by his mistress or by white women of the same class to have connection with them. One formerly enslaved man told Hinton that his mistress ordered him to be intimate with her after her husband died. These white women were using their power to force themselves upon black men and then threatening to accuse them if they refused. So how did this history get buried? How do we end up with the myth of innocent white women instead of the truth about white women who physically and intimately abused black men? The cover-up started immediately after the Civil War. White women began writing books and memoirs that painted slavery as gentle and benign. Historians like Letitia Burwell, who wrote an 1895 memoir on antebellum Southern life, actually argued that slavery was an opportunity to buy, rule over, Christianize, and civilize people of African descent. Really? What a joke. And Southerners were eating up this BS like it was their Sunday brunch. The most famous example is Gone with the Wind, written by Margaret Mitchell, a woman who was born 35 years after slavery ended, but somehow knew enough to write the definitive story about it. These romanticized versions became the official history. When the first generation of professional historians started studying slavery, they relied almost exclusively on white sources, diaries, letters, and memoirs written by the people who had enslaved others. It wasn't until the 1930s, when the Works Progress Administration interviewed thousands of formerly enslaved people, that we started getting the real story. And even then, it took decades for historians to take those voices seriously. The research from Stephanie Jones Rogers shows exactly how this happened. She explains that when she would present her work to scholars in Europe, they'd be unsurprised. There was this kind of consensus among them that women could do these things. But when I talked to American historians, they were saying, "What? Wow!" We wanted to believe in white women's innocence so badly that we ignored the testimony of the people who actually lived through their abuse. When the Civil War ended and enslaved people were supposedly freed, did white women accept this change gracefully? Hell no! Many of them fought to maintain control over black people in any way they could. Some white women literally moved their property away from Union troops, trying to keep enslaved people in bondage even after emancipation. Martha Gibbs took enslaved people all the way to Texas and forced them to work for her at gunpoint until 1866. a full year after slavery was officially abolished. But the most organized resistance came through something called the Women's Klan. Yeah, you heard that right. The most racist group in America had a women's branch, and it was powerful. Starting in the 1920s, the Women's Klan had chapters in every single state. At their peak, they had millions of members. And here's the twisted part. Some of these women claimed they were fighting for women's rights while simultaneously promoting racist ideology. They called themselves feminists while terrorizing Black communities. They organized boycotts, destroyed political careers through poison squads and whisper campaigns, and worked to get Black teachers fired from schools. These women proved that white female empowerment often came at the expense of Black freedom. This was the same mentality that had driven white women to intimately abuse and torture Black men during slavery. The idea that their freedom and power should be built on Black oppression. I know this has been heavy. Learning the full truth about how white women systematically abused Black men during slavery always is. But here's why we tell these stories. Because the men who survived these horrors deserve to have their truth told. For too long, their stories have been silenced, their experiences minimized, their pain ignored in favor of a comfortable lie about innocent white ladies. But we're not about comfortable lives on this channel. We're about uncomfortable truths. The truth is that white women weren't bystanders to slavery. They were architects of it. They didn't just benefit from the system, they actively built it, maintained it, and fought to preserve it. They turned Black men into breeding stock, objects for their pleasure, and tools for their own empowerment. But here's what I want you to remember most. Through all of this horror, through all of this systematic dehumanization, our ancestors survived. They resisted. They protected each other. They found ways to love, to hope, to fight back even in the darkest circumstances. When Black men were forced into unwanted, intimate relationships, some found ways to resist. When they were beaten and humiliated, they endured and made sure future generations would know about it. And part of honoring their legacy is telling the complete truth about what they faced, including the truth about the horrors of these white plantation mistresses. So what do we do with this knowledge? We use it. We share it. We make sure this history doesn't get buried again. We demand that textbooks include these stories. We insist that movies and TV shows stop perpetuating the myth of the innocent white girl. If this video opened your eyes, hit that like button and share it with your family and friends. This is the kind of history that needs to go viral. Drop a comment and let me know what shocked you the most. And make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because we're not stopping here. If you want to learn about some of America's greatest freedom fighters, check out our video on Charles Caldwell, the Black man that terrified Southern bigots.